113 years ago today, the Titanic sank. This is a full timeline of how it happened. At 11:40 p.m. on April 14, 1912, Titanic collides with an iceberg. The watertight doors are closed, but the damage is too extensive and water pours into the ship. At midnight, the captain orders the lifeboats to be prepared while they continue to explore the extent of the damage. At 12:20, the band starts playing, and by 12:25, Thomas Andrews confirms to Captain E.J. Smith the Titanic will sink. Shortly after, passengers are ordered into lifeboats, and at 12:40, an hour after collision, Lifeboat 7 becomes the first to be launched, carrying only half its capacity. And many of these early lifeboats are launched half full because passengers are hesitant. They don't believe Titanic will sink. At 12:47, the first distress rockets are fired, and by 1:15, the water's up to Titanic's nameplate and the list is becoming much more noticeable. By 1:30, there's the first signs of panic as people realize there aren't enough lifeboats for everybody and the ship is sinking quickly. At 2:05, the last lifeboat is launched, with 1,500 people still on board the Titanic. At 2:17, the ship breaks in half and finally sinks at 2:20 on April 15th, 1912, plunging 1,500 people into the freezing water. There was a horrendous scream as people struggled in the water, but unfortunately, within 15 to 20 minutes, the noise died down as people succumbed to hypothermia. Meanwhile, the survivors in the boats were terrified that they would be swamped if they went back. In the end, only Lifeboat 14 returns to the wreck site an hour later, finding just a few people alive in the water. At the same time, the RMS Carpathia, having heard Titanic's distress calls, is steaming full speed ahead towards Titanic's location. And at the break of dawn, survivors finally spot Carpathia in the horizon. At 4:10 a.m., boat number 2 becomes the first lifeboat to be rescued. And over the next few hours, the rescue mission is carried out. By 8:15 a.m., Lifeboat 12 is the last to be picked up. With all 712 passengers now safely aboard, the Carpathia sets a course for New York as the world awaits any news of the disaster. Shortly after the sinking, the RMS Carpathia picked up all 712 survivors from the water, and they headed to Titanic's original destination of New York. On April 18, 1912, the Carpathia finally steamed into New York Harbor on a very rainy and gloomy night. A crowd of 10,000 people had gathered at the Cunard Pier, eagerly awaiting the arrival of the survivors. People were desperate to find out any information about their relatives. There had been a media blackout while on the Carpathia, so a lot of newspapers were simply printing blatantly wrong information, with some initially reporting that everybody had been saved. To everyone's surprise, Carpathia steamed past her berth and headed to White Star Line's Pier 59, which is where Titanic would have docked. And here, Titanic's lifeboats were dropped off. Carpathia then turned around and docked at Pier 54, which exists in New York to this day. Finally, the survivors began to disembark. And Margaret Brown, who had just raised $10,000 for victims, became the last Titanic passenger to step off the ship.